Well, I realized that after I put the disassembly video on, I never showed how to disassemble the mainspring. And with these ETA mainspring barrels, I just use my nail. You can't really see it in the shop, but I use my nail to kind of pry off the cap. And that's because the ETA mainspring barrels are kind of like, they're like a little cap. They're not, you can't really push them off by putting pressure on the teeth of the mainspring. You have to really kind of pop them off. Some people use a razor blade. I have a razor blade on the table there. I find it a little more difficult than just popping it off, and here I've managed to pop it off, and now I'll use a tweezer to actually remove the cover to the mainspring barrel. And I use a little piece of pegwood to hold the barrel down. And there's the cover. Next, I just remove the mainspring arbor. Comes out really quite easily. And the next thing I will do is actually remove the mainspring itself, and you kind of get it started with your tweezers, and then you just kind of work it out with your fingers. You have to make sure it doesn't pop and get away from you. Just keep doing that a few times, alternating left finger to right finger. And then there's the entire mainspring. And this mainspring doesn't look so great, so I'll probably replace it when I reassemble the watch. Okay, we're on to reassembly, the actual reassembly now. And the first thing we're going to do, we're actually going to replace the mainspring on this watch. So here is the mainspring barrel, and we're going to use 8217 grease. This is a braking grease to arrest the automatic mainspring bridle. It allows it to slip, and then it will give it the appropriate amount of resistance so it doesn't slip too much. And that's, again, Mobius 8217. So I just put a little bit of this braking grease on 4 locations, 90 degrees apart, in the mainspring barrel, right along the mainspring barrel wall. And I think some people put this kind of all around the whole wall. I just put a good amount on 4 different locations, and then it kind of gets spread around the wall when the mainspring is wound inside of it. And you notice, of course, I'm using rubber finger cuts as well for touching any of these parts. We don't want, they're all nice and clean now. We don't want to touch anything with our finger and get fingerprints and finger oils on the surfaces. And just spreading a little bit more, spreading it around. Here's the new 7750 mainspring, and when you put these in, you put it in with the blue side of that retaining ring up. That tells you the proper orientation. And these are pre-lubricated, which is great. We just stick it in here into the barrel, and you give it a nice firm press down. If you kind of dilly-dally too much here, you risk not driving the spring fully into the barrel, and that's not a pretty sight. So real quick here, push it right down. I give it a good push over there, probably maybe a little too much, but once it's in there nice and good, we can remove that blue ring and make sure it's fully seated. And this looks good, and you'll notice that the center of the mainspring itself is right over the arbor hole, so it's looking pretty good. Now that we have that done, we have to put the arbor back in. So we're also going to lubricate the arbor before putting it back in, and I use HP 1300 for lubricating the arbor. So here's the arbor, and I actually hold the arbor in a pin vise very lightly, gripped in a pin vise, so that we don't scratch it or otherwise damage it. And I just lubricate the arbor right where it runs into the barrel, and also put a little bit of lubrication on the hook of the arbor. And then I use the pin vise to put it in, give it a little bit of a spin to make sure it's seated pretty, hooked pretty well. And here is the arbor in the mainspring. And I put a little bit more 1300 on the post of the arbor, which will protrude through the cap, the barrel cover. And I'm just going to put the barrel cover back onto the barrel. And I actually did purchase one of these barrel closing tools. You'll see that coming up right here. That's a two-piece tool. You just place the barrel into it. It's got a little hole for the arbor. And I'm just cleaning it out over here. There's a little bit of dust, so I use my Radico to clean it out. And I place the barrel right into the tool. Make sure it's nice and centered. Put the cover on. Give it a nice firm press, and you'll feel it kind of pop into place. And it snaps shut, and that's done. I'll take a little look around the circumference here and make sure it's fully closed, and everything looks pretty good. I'll put my tool away, and that is the mainspring. I just like to do this first when I'm reassembling a watch, get it out of the way and done. And we'll save that barrel for the next step. So next up, we're going to assemble the keyless work. And the first step here, and I have the video speeded up a little bit, is to treat a number of the parts of the keyless work with Mobius 8941 Fixodrop, which is an epilame. An epilame is used to keep oil from spreading in places that you don't want it to spread. It keeps the oil only where you want it to be. Well, I'm taking out all of the parts that need to be coated with the epilame. And now I'm going to put them into the jar with the 8941 in it. And I'm just going to give them a little shake and then take each part out and individually dry it. And the epilame evaporates very quickly. It's very volatile. So you'll notice that I close the jar in between each part. We're also supposed to do the winding stem. I'm going to do that a little bit later, and you'll see why. Well, I'll just tell you. The winding stem was actually soldered onto the crown of the watch, the winding crown, and I'm not really sure why that is. It was obviously broken at some point, so somebody soldered it, so I can't remove it from the crown. You know, I couldn't get a new crown, so I'm just going to treat it separately. And this does take a little bit of a while to do each individual part by itself. I believe I'm almost done here. You notice I put it back. Each part goes back in the parts tray, and I keep the cover, the dust cover on the parts tray, so you want to minimize dust. That's right, I had my camera. I forgot to put the second camera on, so now you see I have the second camera as I continue to dry off the various parts. This is the setting lever. And here's the winding stem, and you can see, if you make it out really quickly, it's soldered into the crown, so I just dipped it into the epilame, holding it with a pair of tweezers so I wouldn't get the epilame on the crown itself. And now we're going to start the assembly. So and these parts were already treated with epilame, so now I'm going to lubricate them with Mobius HP 1300. And that is the winding pinion on the right and the sliding pinion on the left. We put a little bit of 1300 on the ratchet teeth of the winding pinion and the ratchet teeth of the sliding pinion. And I'm using the new fluorescent version of this HP 1300. It's HP 1300 FL, like Foxtrot Lima for fluorescent. And what you do is you can hold a black light over the workpiece, and it will, the lubricant will glow bright green, and it shows you exactly where it is. It's actually very useful, but it didn't show up too well on the camera. But if you ever have trouble seeing where your lubricant lands, here you go. I'm using the black light, and you may have made out that it turns bright green, but it's just for a quick second. And now we're going to use the HP 1300 on the winding stem and put it at the tip, and then on two of the corners of the square part, the square section, I put it along the corner between two faces and on the opposite corner as well. Just put a little bit of HP 1300 there. And then a bit on this shoulder. Right here. And finally a little bit in the slot. That is where the setting lever will rest to hold the winding, the stem in the watch. And I slid the video over here a bit to the right because my it was not in the right place on my workbench. So now I'm sliding the stem into the winding pinion. I just hold the winding pinion so it doesn't fall through the movement. Now the next part will be the sliding pinion. I'm going to do the same thing. I bring it in, pull the stem back a bit, and then place it through the sliding pinion. Pretty simple. I slide it back and forth a little bit to spread the lubrication. And next we use a little bit of Mobius 9504 here. This is from the service manual. I'm not really sure what that, it probably lubricates the surface of the winding pinion where it can potentially rub against the main plate. Now back to the HP 1300 rather, HP 1300 for the rest of the lubrication. So first up is the setting lever, and we're just going to put a little bit HP 1300 on the post of the setting lever. And the setting lever was also treated with the epilame. Just making sure I dry fit it first, make sure I know where it goes. That's that HP 1300. And I place it back in. And we're now ready to replace the yoke. Okay. Gonna put a little 1300 on the post and also at the very tip of the yoke spring. put the yoke in place. Make sure it's resting in the right place in the sliding pinion. I'm going to use a pair of tweezers to pull the yoke spring so that I can slide the yoke in place. So I'm using a nice pair of brass tweezers here. Squeeze the yoke spring. There we go. Squeeze the spring and slide the yoke into place. And just going to make sure that it's in the right place. And I'm going to put a little 1300 right where the yoke meets the setting lever. Move the action in and out a bit to make sure that that lubrication gets where I want it to be. And then I'll clean up some excess with my Rodico. Okay, in the tech manual, it told me to put a little bit of lubrication on the other teeth on the sliding pinions. That's what I just did there. And now I'm lubricating the post that the rocker bar will rest on and the tip of the yoke spring that interacts with the rocker bar. This is the rocker bar, and just have to put a little bit of 1300 on the surface here. And place it into the watch. And again, we have to release the tension on that spring in order to put it in place. And this is the time setting gear. Just lubricate the post. And then I'll place it on there. And that's the intermediate setting wheel. That intermediate setting wheel sits on that post on the rocker bar, but we need to, in order to get that on there, we have to actually slide it onto the setting lever spring. So you'll see how I do that. I'm just going to put some 1300 on the rocker bar post. And here's the setting lever spring, and I put a little bit of lubrication right where I'm showing you, and this lubrication will that's where the intermediate setting wheel will rest. Intermediate setting wheel, slide it into place here, and then I can lift the setting lever spring with that intermediate setting wheel in it and place it into the watch. And then replace the screws. And what I do here is I put the screws in fairly loose, but just snug enough, and I don't put this tension spring in place on the setting lever just yet. I first want to get the screws down in place, again, without making them tight. You don't want to deform the spring, but just snug enough to hold it in place and keep everything from moving all over the place. So once that's done, I will now use my tweezers to pull that spring into place right there. And I can now tighten the screws down. Make sure everything's in place, everything's aligned, and then tighten the screws. And everything works really well. And last but not least, again, I'm going to take my Rodico and just clean up everything. I use the black light. Getting hard to see on the camera, but it shows me where the lubrication is. And one thing I forgot to do, so I'm just going to turn the watch over and put a little bit of 1300 in the groove in the sliding pinion. I should have done that before I put the yoke in place, but that's okay. I could just do it this way. Now rotate the winding stem. Okay, and now we're ready to assemble the train of wheels. So first up, this is something that is not listed in the 7750 technical manual, but I am going to treat the escape wheel in Epilame Fixodrop, just like I did with some of the other parts. I will do this. I'll also treat the impulse face of the pallet stones later. This technique was recommended to me by several master watchmakers. So just dipped this whole escape wheel right in the epilame, and now I'm going to just lift it up and dry it with some air. And again, this stuff is very volatile, so it evaporates very quickly. A little bit of dust on my workbench there. And the first step is to insert the barrel. And before I do that, I'm going to use some HP 1300 and put it on the arbor. And I'll do this side here, which goes into the main plate first. So I'm just going to put a little bit of 1300 right on the pivot here, right on the arbor. And what I do is, I'm checking again with that black light, I'm really kind of enjoying that black light. Before I lubricate the other side, I actually put it, the barrel, into the movement. This way I don't get the lubrication on, it doesn't get rubbed off on anything when I turn the barrel over. So now I can lubricate the top of the arbor with 1300. And now we're ready to start actually placing the wheels, the train wheels, back into the movement. And we do this in the reverse order of how we disassembled the watch. So first we'll place the escape wheel. There we go. Next up, you may recall at the beginning when I was disassembling the watch, I referred to the second wheel and the seconds wheel. That's this wheel here. Someone on the Watch Repair Talk forum informed me this was not the original seconds wheel, so I purchased this ETA replacement second wheel from Star Time, and I'm going to use that when I reassemble the watch. So here's you can see the difference in the thickness of the rim. So I'll just save the cloned seconds wheel just in case this original part doesn't actually work. And I'm not really sure why I keep the little overhead camera view in the upper left corner of this screen. I think it's better served in the lower right corner, so I'm gonna move that down so you get a better view. Also make it larger. And now we're putting in the third wheel. And making sure it's seated very well. And now the great wheel, or some call it the center wheel. And the tech manual talks about putting a little bit of 90-10 right here where the chronograph seconds wheel will go through, and I'm doing this. You can see it under my microscope, and I used the black light there to help me place that lubrication. And this is a stop lever here, otherwise known as the hack, and this is what causes the balance wheel to stop when you pull the winding stem out, so you can set the seconds exactly. And even though the manual doesn't call for this, I always put some 1300, HP 1300, just two little dots of it on the surface where this stop lever will slide. Place the stop lever such that the top of it rests in the slot of the sliding pinion. That's on the left side, right by my tweezers there. And once this is in place, we can actually replace the barrel bridge. And that's what's coming up next. And we're just going to gently position the barrel bridge in place. Obviously, we want to be careful not to break any of the pivots on the train of any of the gears. And right there, you can see it kind of fell right in place. And these ETA movements are pretty good. Like, actually, all of the gears are in the jewels now. I'm just going to check by gently holding down with a piece of pegwood, and the train is actually fully operational. And I just give a little pressure to the the mainspring barrel, and I can see the train runs freely. And I just make sure that the barrel bridge is fully installed. And now I'll replace the 3 screws that secure the barrel bridge. That's number 2. And number 3. And what I do is I just hold a little pressure with a piece of pegwood, and then I can tighten the screws. And once this is all done, I can then lubricate the jewels for the train wheels. And we use 1300 HP 1300 on the great wheel and the third wheel pivots. Just cleaning off my oiler with a little Radico. Some dust on it. So that's the great wheel. And the third wheel. And now we're going to switch. I'm going to clean my oiler off and switch to 9010, Mobius 9010 for the third wheel. Sorry, for the second wheel or the fourth wheel and the escape wheel. So this is the second wheel, otherwise known as the fourth wheel, and the escape wheel. Now we reverse the movement. And again, when we have dial up, I use the Burgeon holder, movement holder. And we'll now lubricate the other side. So this is HP 1300. And that's the great wheel. And the third wheel. And again, switching to cleaning the oiler. And then switching over to Mobius 9010 for the second wheel or the fourth wheel. And finally for the escape wheel. And that is the assembly of the train of wheels.